Amelia Dyer. One can hardly imagine a more horrific human being. Over the course of 3 decades, she was responsible for the brutal murder of over 400 babies and infants. She was a baby farmer, a serial killer, and her sole motivation was monetary. Known infamously as the Ogress of Reading, she stands as one of the most notorious figures in the annals of British crime. Born in Pile Marsh, Bristol, England, in 1837, her early life offered little hint of the grisly path that she would later tread. However, what emerged was a picture of a woman whose name would become synonymous with unthinkable horror, deceit, and a staggering death toll. Early life and background. Born into a family of shoemakers, Amelia was one of 5 children. Despite her family's relative poverty, she was literate and even had some training in nursing. Her upbringing was marred by the mental illness of her mother caused by typhus, which ultimately claimed her life. This early exposure to the effects of mental illness may have had a lasting impact on Dyer. Dyer's early adulthood was marked by tragedy. Following her mother's death, her father succumbed to the same fate when she was just 22, leaving her to fend for herself. In time, Amelia married George Thomas, and they had 2 children. Despite the challenges of her personal life, Dyer developed a business as a baby farmer. Entry into baby farming. Baby farming, a dubious practice common in the Victorian era, involved accepting custody of illegitimate children in exchange for payment. The societal stigma and economic burden of illegitimate children meant that many desperate mothers sought out these baby farmers, who would either adopt or foster the children, often for a significant fee. Dyer exploited this practice, taking in the children with the promise of care and a good home, and it was these mothers that Dyer took advantage of, and their children. However, the truth was tragically far from this promise. Rather than providing care and sustenance, Dyer's motive was purely profit. While there were many reports of neglect, starvation, and physical abuse, children under her care began to die, and while suspicion arose, it was often chalked up to the high infant mortality rate of the time, which was very common in the Victorian era. Over the years, Dyer's crimes escalated from neglect to intentional murder. She discovered that it was more profitable and less trouble to simply murder the children and dispose of their bodies instead of looking after them and feeding them. At first, Dyer used laudanum, a common opium-based tincture, to place the children starving under her care into a state of slumber, and one by one they died from malnutrition or reportedly from overdosing on the opium-based drug. But as time went by, Dyer found it cheaper and more efficient to kill the children under her care by strangulation, using white dressing tape, a signature that later led to her downfall. Amelia lived this way for quite a while, moving from place to place, often in Reading. Her criminal activities were punctuated with stints in mental asylums, where she was treated for suicidal tendencies and what she claimed was fits of the brain. Whether these were genuine episodes or manipulative attempts to avoid law remains uncertain. Psychological analysis and motives. The motivations behind Amelia's heinous crimes have been the subject of speculation and psychological analysis for many years. Some experts believe that Dyer suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a disorder in which an individual seeks attention by harming or causing illness to someone under their care. This theory suggests that Amelia craved attention and control, using her role as a baby farmer to exert power over those individual, vulnerable lives. Others argue that she was driven by financial gain, exploiting the desperation of impoverished mothers for her own monetary benefit. While the exact motivations remain unclear, it is evident that Dyer possessed a disturbing lack of empathy and a willingness to commit unspeakable acts for her own personal gain. Unmasking the Monster. On March the 30th, 1896, a parcel weighed down with bricks was fished out of the River Thames. It contained the body of a baby girl, later identified as Helena Fry. This child, like many others, had a piece of white tape around her neck. The police traced the parcel wrapping and paper to Amelia Dyer. The subsequent search of her house revealed a shocking number of pawn tickets for clothes from children and letters from mothers and advertisements for her baby farming business. It was clear that Amelia had been selling the clothes of her killed victims. Arrested on April 4th, 1896, Dyer was charged with murder, and during the investigation, it was discovered that Dyer had killed likely over 400 children over the decades, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in known history. During the investigation, many more bodies were found, and Dyer was quoted as saying, "You'll know mine by the tape around their necks." The trial of Amelia Dyer was swift. Despite her attempts to plead insanity, citing her history of asylum internment, the jury was unconvinced. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. The medical community also disputed her claims of insanity, with many believing her bouts of mental illness being faked to avoid suspicion and capture by the police. On June the 10th, 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison. Her execution marked the end of a reign of terror that had lasted for nearly 3 decades. Amelia Dyer's story serves as a grim reminder of a society that, in its desperation to maintain appearances, allowed the unthinkable to occur. Such were the ways in the Victorian ages. Legal reforms and aftermath. While the life and crimes of Amelia Dyer are chilling, they are also sparked with significant change. In the wake of the trial, there was public outrage and calls for reforms in adoption laws, which eventually led to the passage of the 1908 Children Act. In retrospect, Amelia Dyer's horrific crimes offered a snapshot of the darker aspects of Victorian society, exposing the social pressures, vulnerabilities, and unspoken tragedies of that era. It should be noted that during the Victorian era, baby farming was a common practice, and Amelia was not the only murderer of children. Yet her story is not just about her as an individual, but about the society that both shaped and was eventually forced to confront the consequences of her horrific deeds. This has been Misterie. Be sure to subscribe for more true crime documentaries.